So we're back with part 3 of lesson 2. We've set up our form. We've set up our database. And we've created variables to capture the form inputs. So now we're going to get into connecting to the database, actually saving our code. So here's what our connection looks like. First, we're going to set up a variable. I'll just call it DB for database. And what we're going to create a new database connection object. So, and we're going to do this using the Pdo library. So Pdo is a data access library for connecting from PHP to some kind of database. So to do this, we're going to create a new Pdo object. And my code editor, it's kind of hinting about what the parameters are. So if we want to connect our PHP page to our MySQL database, there's some information we're going to have to provide. What things do you think we're going to have to provide in our connection? Josh, and I'll come to your question in a minute. What information are we going to have to provide in order for our PHP page to be able to talk to the database? How are we going to know what database to connect to? Which server, which database? So what's going to go in here? Right, there's millions of databases in the world. How is our PHP page going to know which database it's supposed to use to save the data? Okay, we're going to need the database name. Yep, that's one, right? So we're going to need to name the database, which is phpflix. What other information? Yeah, the URL. So what's the address of the server? Can I make the code larger? I can try. And normally we'd also need a database username and password, right? Because the databases are going to be secure. So here's what we also need to specify: what kind of database are we connecting to? So this has 5 vowels required. DB type, server address, DB name, username, password. So these are the 5 values we're going to need to provide anytime we want to connect PHP page to our database. Andre's excellent question. I'll come to that in a minute. Yes. So first, we're going to provide our database type as MySQL, because we could use Pdo to connect to other types of databases. In this class, we're only ever going to use MySQL. And we put in a colon. And our host in this case, for today, we're using our local database. So that local IP is 127.0.0.1. We'll modify this probably next week once our AWS server is back up and running. We then put in a semicolon. So we've now provided 2 of the parameters, right? The type of database, which is MySQL, the address of the server, 127.0.0.1. We then need DB name equals, and in this case, we called our database name phpflix. These 3 values are in a single string parameter. So we've got a colon as a delimiter here, and a semicolon as a delimiter here. So the syntax is a bit weird. Then we've got the username parameter, which on our local machine, the username by default is called root. And the password by default is empty. Next week, or whenever we're able to access AWS, we're going to have to change 4 of these 5 parameters. The host is going to change. Yes and no. We'll talk about MySQL in a moment. The database name is going to change, and your username and password. These things are all different on AWS. Now, there's a few questions in the chat I want to address. First question was about get and post. Can we use get? No, we shouldn't be using get. For the reasons we talked about earlier. We don't want to use get because our form is using post, and we use post so that the values do not appear in our address bar. Remember, if we use get, this is what happens. If I use get, all of the values show up in the address bar. We should not be using get for form submissions unless our form is a search form. So we should be using post and not get. Get works, but it's not secure. We are going to use post. Okay, several of you have asked about MySQLi and Pdo. If you read online, you may find older PHP material that uses MySQLi. So what is the difference? There are 2 differences. First of all, MySQLi is older. PHP, if you go watch my lessons in this class from like 6-7 years ago, which I think are on YouTube, I used MySQLi because it used to be the standard. Pdo, for probably at least the last 5 years, has become the new standard. And the big difference between Pdo and MySQLi is MySQLi can only connect to a MySQL database. You can't use any kind of other database. Whereas Pdo is designed to work with MySQL or other databases. So by using Pdo, it allows us, if we ever change the type of database in the back end, we don't have to rewrite all the code in our web application. We would simply have to change the database connection string. All the rest of the code for interacting with our database would stay the same. MySQLi is not as flexible. It doesn't allow us to change the type of the database. So in answer to your question, Viraj, can we use MySQLi Connect? You can, technically, yes, but we're not going to in this class. And if you use MySQLi Connect, a lot of the code I do in class, you will have to write very differently. All the commands for writing queries, for using loops, for saving data, it's all different. So in this course, I don't want you using MySQLi. And if you do, it's up to you, but you're on your own to figure out all the differences. I'm not going to go through the MySQLi versions. I'm only using Pdo. It is the standard. It is what you should be using. Andres, yes, you can use a try catch as well if you want to. We'll deal with error handling later in the term. After reading week, absolutely, you're free to use it. For now, I don't want, if there's an error, I want it to fail because I want to see the error messages. So generally, I don't want to put try catch blocks in until most of our code's actually working. It's actually harder to debug with try catch blocks. So you can put them in if you want. I don't recommend them at this stage. The host IP, well, if it's locally, it's always going to be 127.0.0.1. That's all. That always refers to localhost. So that always means your local computer. So there's our connection. And now I'm going to write the disconnect already, because when we're done with the database, we should always disconnect. Why do you think we should disconnect when we're done working with the database? Safety is one, yep, so that connection isn't open. Yep, to protect, but there's another reason as well. It has to do with performance. Shashank, you're on the right track. Shashank, sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. Do databases, do servers have unlimited numbers of connections available? Can a web database server let, like a billion people connect at one time? Or are there limits? Yeah, there's some kind of limit. So the rule is with database connections, open them when we need them, but close them as soon as we can so that other requests, yeah, Lassa, that's right. We're preventing deadlock and server being overloaded. So our connect line is a little complex. Our disconnect is really simple. We just set that connection to null once we're done with it. So we create the connection object here. Once we're done saving the data, we want to disconnect. So now we're going to set up our SQL command. So I'm going to create a variable called SQL. And this is what it looks like. So the structure of a statement, we say insert into, and then we put in the name of our table. Then we open a set of round brackets, and we put in a list of the column names we want to insert into. So we are inserting into title, rating, and release year. And remember, these are case sensitive. So the names have to match exactly. The column names in the database. They are case sensitive. We're not inserting the movie ID because the database will do it, and we're ignoring the image for now. So we're only inserting 1, 2, 3 values. And then we set up with a second set of brackets. No, the commands are not case sensitive, but it's common practice to write the SQL keywords, many developers do it, in all caps. And then what I'm going to set up an insert command with placeholders for our 3 values. Yeah, you mean here. Oh no, that's just a variable. I'm just creating a variable. I mean, they will be case sensitive when I go to use them. I typically use lowercase and camel case for my variables in PHP. Later on next semester, when we work in the Microsoft world, Microsoft uses Pascal case. So when we're working in C#, I would create, instead of release year like that, in C#, I'll create a variable like this. It'll look like this next fall, because that's the Microsoft convention, has been for decades. So now I'm going to set up 3 placeholders, which I delimit with a colon. Title, rating, and colon release year. So these represent parameters. This is the name of the table. So our database might have lots of tables. So we need to specify which table in the database, right? For now, we only have one movies table, but later on, we're going to have, genres table. We might have studios. We might have actors. So we need to specify which table in the database are we saving to. Okay, we don't just save data to the database. We connect to a database and then we save into a specific table. Right? So we created the table called movies. Does that make sense? And I'll show you another table. Like here's another table in my database. Let's just go look. So in here, for example, there's only one table there. Here, this isn't PHP. I can show you another database. most databases you make will have a whole bunch of tables. So I'll just show you another database I have. It's a Microsoft database with lots of tables. Let's see. What databases do I have here? This was from last semester. We made what did we make? We made a food store. So what are the tables? We had tables for users and roles. And then we had a shopping cart where we had categories, products, and orders. So when we're saving to a database, Justin was asking, what does movies mean here? It means which table inside the database are we going to save this data to? We're connecting to our PHPFlix database, but we need to know where is the data going to go. It's going to go into the movies table. That make sense? So now we're going to need another variable, which I will call a command. I'll use the variable cmd. So we're going to take our database object, and it's got this method called prepare. So we're preparing, I'll put in a comment here, create a command object using our DB connection and SQL command from above. So we're going to combine our database connection and our SQL instruction. It's a little bit of an intermediate step here. This syntax is kind of weird in PHP. This is object-oriented PHP syntax. This dash and a greater than. In most languages, like Java, when we use object-oriented syntax, we have an object, and if we want to call a method, we put object.prepare. So in Java, syntax is something like this, db.prepare. PHP, this is an annoying thing about PHP syntax. It doesn't use the dot because, as we saw last week, the dot in PHP is the concatenate operator. So PHP uses this instead. When we have an object and we want to call a method, we use this dash greater than, which is really weird syntax. So we're preparing our command, but before we can execute the insert and save to the database, we need to do something with our values. We've grabbed them here and put them into variables, but we now need to take each of these variables and populate the corresponding parameters. So title from here has to get filled in here. Rating has to get filled in here. Release here has to get filled in here. So we're going to map each of these variables into the corresponding parameters. So we'll take our command. We're going to call this method called bind parameter. So first, I'm going to fill the parameter title with our parameter variable. So basically, stick this variable in this placeholder. We also have to specify the data type. In this case, our title is a string of no more than 100 characters. We're going to repeat this with the rating and the year. The year will be a little different because it's an integer, not character data. So next, we're going to fill the rating. It's also a string. And I think in our database, we said the rating was only 10 characters. I'll go and check the database. Bear with me. I'll put the code back up. Just want to see what's going on. Yeah, we said our rating was 10 characters. Title was 100, rating was 10. And then we'll bind release year. This one is an integer. The integer length is predefined, so we don't need this final parameter. So this will populate each of our values into the corresponding placeholder. Now, you might ask, why do we need to do this? Why set up these placeholders and then populate them? Like, doesn't this seem complicated and like a lot of code? Couldn't we do this instead? Let's copy this. Why don't we just inject the variables right here? Right? Could we do that? And then we could skip these lines of code. Do you think this version would work? So we're using line 19. It would work technically, but there's a big risk. Here's the risk, and I'll show you why I never want to see this version on line 20. Because with the version on line 20, where we just take the variables and inject them directly into our SQL command, somebody could do this. Something like, what would happen if I injected this variable directly into our command, do you think? Anybody know what this is called? When users put SQL commands into our forms? Why would somebody do this?
Oh, that's SQL injection, right?
That is SQL injection. So this is one of the most common hacking attempts that hackers try and run. So what would happen if I ran this command? Drop table movies. What would it do? Yes, it would crash the site. What would it do specifically in the database, do you think? What do you think drop table would do? Yeah, it would delete the table. Wouldn't steal the info, it would erase it. It would empty it and it would remove the table entirely. So if we use this version, this is vulnerable to SQL injection attempts. So we never want to use this version. It's a shortcut to just dump the variables into our SQL, but it's very dangerous. So we're never going to use that version. By setting up the parameters and then filling them, using this bind param method, it escapes any SQL commands. So they will be saved as strings and they will not execute. So it's more code. It's a lot more work to use the bind param method with these parameters, but it's necessary for safety. So once we've populated these, now we can just call our command has an execute method. So this is then going to run our insert that's populated with our 3 parameters. This should actually save a movie to the database. So nothing happens in the database until line 31. All of this stuff is just setup. Get the values, connect to the database, set up our instruction, compare and populate the values in. And then lastly, on line 31, this is where we're actually running the code. After line 31 executes, hopefully we'll have a movie in the database. And that movie will be stored permanently. And then lastly, we can just print a message that says movie saved. We will go and try this out. If it works, our page should say movie saved, and then we can go and check the database in the phpMyAdmin site, and we should see a movie. Okay, okay, I have another question about MySQL through Pdo, so maybe we missed this. I will go over this one more time. MySQLi is a library for accessing a MySQL database only from PHP. It's old. PHP is the standard way for connecting a PHP application to any kind of database. They do the same thing, but they're not the same, and the code is different. So we are going to use Pdo in this class, and it's required that you use Pdo as well, because all of this code, if you're not using Pdo, it's all different. The way MySQLi does this, it's very different from Pdo. Hamid, do you have to populate this? Yeah, if you don't populate the variables, then you're not saving anything to the database. You must populate the variables using this bind param syntax, which also prevents SQL injection. So no, this is not the only possible way you could get this to work, but it is the current standard and best practice. So technically you could use the MySQLi library instead, but you will have to go and find all this code because it's all going to be different. So I recommend you follow along and do things this way in class. It is the current standard and best practice. So I'm going to save this code. We're going to try it out. Now the code is finicky. One little syntax error is enough to break the whole thing. So, missing, let's say, a comma here, I missed that. This will be enough to crash the whole page, or I miss a semicolon. So one of the things you're going to have to get used to with PHP is it's very exacting. So I will go, and I'm now going to try to save a movie. So you can put in any movie you like. My favorite movie of all time is The Godfather. So I'm going to try out my form. If I don't get an error message, if I get a movie saved, I should then be able to go over here and see the movie. So I'm going to save it. I got a movie save message, so that's encouraging. And now if I want to check my database, if I'm in my movies table, I can click the browse button. And now you can see here, it took a minute. I now have movie ID 1000, the title, rating, and release here. And my image is null. So it saved my first movie. So if I shut my computer off and then come back next week, this is stored permanently. Yeah, I will post all this code up online in just a minute. I'm going to save a couple more movies. So check your syntax with mine. Like I said, I will post it online for you to reference. Yep. If I restart my computer, this movie is in the database permanently, unless I delete it. I'm going to add a couple more movies to the database. And then we're pretty much done for the day. Actually, we may have time to do one more thing. We'll see. We may have to do it next week. I'm going to go back. Yes, I will share the PHP files. I'll say The Godfather 2, which was in 1974, the only sequel to ever win Best Picture. Yep, semicolon. You mentioned it, Belinda. So when I save, I get movie saved again. If I hit refresh, I've now got movie ID 1001. I'll maybe go add one more. Oops, so this is also on my to watch list from late last year. It's now on Netflix. Yeah, I'll explain why, Belinda. So I save and refresh. So now I've got 3 movies in my database. That's right, Belinda, it's because of the echo. Daniel, it will be stored on the computer where your database is running. So it's stored in the MySQL server you are using. Now, once we get connected to AWS, we're not going to work with our local database. We want to store this stuff in the AWS database, but it's not online for right now. So we'll redo this database stuff once we get AWS back and running, which hopefully should be next week. Okay, so now I can create as many movies. Where's the database physically located? Where physically on your machine? Let's see. I think the database, I believe, is in XAMPP MySQL data. Here. So it created a folder when we created the database. There's a database called PHP Flicks. So here is the movies table. So it's here, physically, inside of XAMPP MySQL data. And there it is. I don't think you can read these files. Like if I tried to open it with Notepad, it's probably like a binary file. Yeah, that's what you get. It's not actually readable. So once you've saved, if you click in your PHPMyAdmin, you click on Browse, you should be able to see the data in here. And the actual file on your computer is in XAMPP MySQL data. And you'll have a folder for each database you create. So if we shut our computers off and come back next Monday, this data is stored permanently. Yeah, it is. So now that we've got data stored, then we can start to build web pages next week where we can display the movies. We can show a list of movies, and then we can click on one, and we can see the details. And then later on, we'll add the ability to edit, delete, upload a photo. I think so. I think it's cool. All right, so here's what I'm going to do. Just going to go over the checklist for next week. We'll deal with implementing Bootstrap. So for next week, you should have created the table in your database, followed the in-class exercises. I will post the code to GitHub in a minute. You can ignore this bit about uploading to AWS because AWS is not working for us right now. So we'll take that out. I think everyone's already completed the academic integrity pledge. And you do have a quiz on connecting and saving data. It's due next week. Right. It's PDO. It stands for PHP Data Object. Okay, I will upload my code to GitHub quickly. I'll stick around in the room. If anybody needs help, if you've got this all working, then have a great week, and I'll see you next Monday. So I'm going to stop the recording. Give me a minute to post to GitHub. The link is on Blackboard.